In less than 5 minutes, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett was thrown out of a courtroom. Not for breaking the law, but for daring to speak the truth. The footage exploded across the internet, triggered a federal investigation, and sent shockwaves through the highest levels of power. What did she say that made a judge snap? And why is the system desperate to bury it? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. It was supposed to be a normal Monday, the kind where emails piled up, aides knocked politely, and policy memos blurred into one another. But that morning, as sunlight barely touched the corner of Jasmine Crockett's DC office, something sat on her desk that didn't belong. It wasn't the thickness of the envelope that struck her first. It was the silence it brought with it. A stillness, like the air itself had paused. Heavy stock paper, wax seal, gold-embossed header. Federal Judiciary. She flipped it open slowly, cautiously, like peeling back the lid of a bomb. And then she saw it. One name printed with unmistakable authority. Judge Meredith Langston. Her eyes narrowed. The subject line read, "Summons to Oversight Hearing." The tone was cold, clinical, the kind of bureaucratic language that tried to hide the blade under velvet. But Jasmine wasn't fooled. She'd been in this game long enough to know the difference between oversight and overreach. This wasn't a request. It was a warning. The language in the subpoena was vague, intentionally vague. No specific violation, no direct accusation, just a catch-all phrase, potential administrative discrepancies in procedural conduct. That could mean anything or nothing. But what stood out, what rang alarm bells deep in her gut, was that Langston, a sitting federal judge with decades of loyalty to establishment politics, was the one chairing the hearing. That wasn't protocol. That wasn't procedure. That was personal. Jasmine's breath slowed as she lowered the papers, her thoughts turning sharp and surgical. They weren't just coming after her. They were crafting a stage, and she was the centerpiece. She didn't waste time. Her hands moved on instinct, dialing her attorney, the same one who'd once prosecuted cartel bosses before switching sides to defend activists. "It's me," she said, voice low, controlled. "Langston sent a subpoena." Silence. Then a dry response. "They're testing you." He didn't ask for details. He didn't need them. "This isn't oversight, Jasmine. It's theater. You're the opening act, and probably the finale too." She stood, pacing slowly, heart steady but fists clenched. "What's their play?" she asked. "They want a headline, a public scolding. Maybe even to provoke you into a misstep so they can paint you as reckless, radical. You're loud, smart, and unapologetic. That's 3 strikes in their playbook." Jasmine stared out her office window as traffic crawled by, the Capitol dome looming in the distance. "Let them play their part," she said, "but I won't read from their script." She wasn't walking into a courtroom. She was walking into a firing line. From the moment Jasmine Crockett stepped out of the black SUV, the world felt different. The cold spring air bit harder than usual, and the noise, constant, electric, wrapped around her like a second skin. Flashbulbs exploded in bursts. Reporters shouted over one another, their questions sharp as shrapnel. "Congresswoman, do you fear retaliation? Are you expecting an arrest?" But she said nothing. Her eyes were steady, her steps deliberate. She wore a deep navy pantsuit, sharp lines, 0 frills. Hair pulled back, lips set in stone. Her silence was not weakness. It was strategy. Every camera caught it, but no one could spin it. Jasmine Crockett walked into that courthouse like she owned the floor. Inside, the noise didn't follow her, but the tension did. The courtroom was suffocating in its order. Polished marble, spotless oak benches, walls that absorbed sound and echoed authority. It smelled of cold air and old paper. And then there was Judge Meredith Langston, seated high above, draped in tradition like armor. She didn't look at Jasmine. She examined her, as if she were a specimen. No greeting, no acknowledgement. Just that cold stare that said, "You don't belong here, and you will be reminded of it." Langston didn't move much. She didn't have to. Her presence filled the room with the kind of silence that doesn't invite calm. It imposes it. The gavel hadn't dropped yet, but the verdict had already been whispered. The people in the gallery knew it. Staffers, journalists, aides. They leaned forward just enough to see better, like spectators at a public reckoning. But this wasn't about justice. It was about performance. Jasmine was here to be presented, not heard, to be reduced, not respected. The optics had been crafted with surgical precision. The judge as the arbiter of order, and Jasmine, outspoken, unbending, inconvenient, as the one to be tamed. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't fair. It wasn't justice. But Jasmine Crockett didn't come for fairness. She came to expose the farce, and the first crack in the mask was coming. She knew the hearing wouldn't be fair, but Jasmine Crockett hadn't expected it to feel like a slow, public ambush. The lead prosecutor, Marshal Dean, moved across the courtroom like a man who knew exactly how far he was allowed to go. His voice was calm, collected, but every word he spoke was a sharpened blade. He held up a folder thick with printouts. "Congresswoman Crockett," he began, "in a speech last March, you said, 'The courtroom isn't always where truth is found. Sometimes it's where truth goes to die quietly.'" He looked at her, then around the room, letting the silence twist the quote into something darker. Jasmine kept her face still, but her chest tightened. That comment had been made in the context of wrongful convictions, a conversation about systemic reform. "Do you still stand by that statement?" he asked. "Or would you like to withdraw it now under oath?" She turned to Judge Langston, expecting at least some resistance to the obvious misdirection. But Langston just stared ahead, stone-faced, saying nothing. Jasmine's lawyer rose quickly. "Objection. Relevance." Langston cut him off with a cold, flat tone. "Overruled. The question stands." That was all it took to confirm what Jasmine already knew. This wasn't oversight. It was a trap, carefully set, executed with precision, and she was the one being hunted. Prosecutor Dean didn't stop. He walked over to a screen now displaying an old tweet from Jasmine's personal account, 3 years old. "This is a post you liked, criticizing a Supreme Court ruling tied to private prison contracts," he said. "Do you recall this?" Jasmine looked up at the screen. It wasn't just irrelevant. It was absurd. "So now liking a post is evidence?" she asked, voice sharp but calm. "We're establishing your pattern of hostility toward the judiciary," Dean replied. "It speaks to your mindset." Jasmine locked eyes with him. "No, it speaks to your desperation." Then came another quote, another speech, another twist. "At a university town hall, you once told students, 'Disruption is often the first sign that something broken is resisting repair.' Do you consider your behavior here today to be disruptive, Congresswoman?" The question was a trap wrapped in a smile, not meant to get an answer, meant to create a headline. Dean wasn't trying to reveal truth. He was trying to twist Jasmine's passion into proof of bias. He was turning her public record into a weapon. And the worst part, Judge Langston allowed it. Not a single challenge, not a single redirection, just silence, cold, controlled, deliberate. Jasmine realized then that she wasn't being questioned. She was being branded. They weren't trying to find out what she believed. They were trying to show that belief itself, especially when it came from a woman like her, was dangerous. That strong convictions were threats. That clarity was instability. They were painting her as radical, emotional, too loud. The kind of labels meant to stick in the minds of viewers and headlines long after the hearing ended. But Jasmine wasn't new to this. She'd been told before to tone it down, to wait her turn, to be softer, quieter, smaller, and every time, she refused. This courtroom wasn't breaking her. It was proving her point. She sat back in her chair, spine straight, letting them keep going, because the more they tried to twist her words, the more obvious it became. This wasn't justice on display. It was fear dressed in robes and suits. And fear, when it holds power, always overplays its hand. But Jasmine had reached her threshold, and it wasn't just anger, it was clarity. The questions had twisted her words, cherry-picked her speeches, weaponized her beliefs. One more time, Prosecutor Dean leaned in with faux concern, flipping through notes like he was looking for answers, but only digging for ammunition. Congresswoman, you've made several public remarks criticizing court decisions, he said, eyes narrowing. Would you say your personal disdain for this institution impacts your ability to respect its authority today? That was it, the final straw. Jasmine's eyes didn't blink. Her jaw tightened and her voice came out low, even, but charged like a live wire. I was summoned here in the name of justice, she said, not to be interrogated for daring to use my voice. The silence that followed was explosive, not the kind that empties a room, but the kind that tightens every chest in it. You could hear a paper shift 3 rows back, a cough that stopped halfway. Even Judge Langston, cold as stone since the opening gavel, looked up, just slightly. Jasmine wasn't done. She leaned forward, shoulders square, voice rising just a fraction. If this hearing was about oversight, we'd be discussing policies, records, and facts. But what's happening here? This is a spectacle. I'm not being questioned on actions. I'm being dissected for opinions, not judged for misconduct, but for discomfort I've caused people in power. Her hand pressed lightly on the desk now, steady. You're not asking about my job. You're asking why I have the nerve to challenge the system that protects yours. Langston didn't interrupt, but her fingers began to tap the gavel. Once, twice, like a nervous tell beneath her robe. Jasmine caught it, and she leaned in further. This room isn't sterile. It's staged. These questions aren't legal. They're loaded. You've twisted every quote into a weapon and every belief into suspicion. But I'm not going to sit here and smile while you turn my passion into a liability. She looked at Langston directly now. Her voice wasn't shaking. It was cutting. You want me quiet? File the charge. Say the words, make your move. But don't pretend this is about order when it's really about obedience. The room wasn't just quiet. It was watching. The camera crews behind the glass, the aides in suits, the clerks pretending to take notes. All of them saw it. This wasn't defiance for attention. This was defense against erasure. But Jasmine's calm refusal to fold, to apologize for having principles, was exactly what Judge Meredith Langston could not stomach. The courtroom was no longer just tense. It was brittle. Like one wrong word could shatter everything. The bailiffs, who had been statues at the edges of the room, now looked alert, ready. The air itself felt heavier, as if pulled down by the weight of what was about to happen. Langston's knuckles whitened around her gavel. Her breathing, though controlled, had shortened. She wasn't responding as a judge anymore. She was reacting as someone who felt challenged, personally. She slammed the gavel down once, a sharp crack, then again, louder. Congresswoman Crockett, she said, her voice tight and clipped. You are out of order. This courtroom is not a campaign stage. Jasmine didn't move, didn't blink. Her posture didn't change. She sat there completely still, and when she spoke, her voice was low but solid. And I'm not here to perform, she said. I'm here to testify. It was a simple line, but it landed like a blow. There was no heat in it, no raised tone, just the cold precision of a truth delivered without fear. That unnerved Langston even more, because Jasmine wasn't yelling. She was just refusing to bow, and that made her dangerous. Langston tried to regain control, leaning forward, her voice dropping into something darker. You will answer only what is asked, without commentary, without tone. The statement was almost laughable in its irony, but Jasmine didn't smirk. She looked at Langston calmly and said, So truth is acceptable, only if it's comfortable? Her voice didn't rise, but it struck the room like lightning. A quiet gasp broke out in the gallery, then silence again. Langston's mouth twitched. Her composure was slipping. Her jaw clenched so tight it looked painful. One more word out of turn, she hissed, and I will hold you in contempt of this court. Jasmine rose slowly, not in protest, not to posture, but like someone who was simply done sitting through a lie. She placed her hands gently on the desk, her shoulders back. If telling the truth in this courtroom is considered contempt, she said, eyes locked with Langston, then hold me. Because I didn't come here to play a role in your script. I came here to speak honestly. And if that's a threat to this process, then maybe this process is the problem. The room held its breath. The prosecutor stopped shuffling his papers. A bailiff shifted his weight but didn't move. Even the courtroom clock seemed to tick louder. Langston's hand trembled slightly as she reached again for her gavel. She didn't want to hesitate, but she did. Just long enough for everyone to see it. Then, bang! "Enough," she snapped. "You are hereby held in contempt of court." The words echoed harder than the wood. The moment landed with the force of a verdict, even though no trial had taken place. She had turned a congressional hearing into a sentence. The room froze. Even the bailiffs, men trained to act fast, paused. It wasn't that they didn't hear the order. It was that it felt wrong. This wasn't a security breach. This wasn't a disruption. This was punishment for dignity. Still, after a long second, one of them stepped forward. The other followed. Jasmine didn't resist. She didn't raise her voice or try to make a scene. She simply turned, chin lifted, and said clearly to Langston and everyone watching, "You're not punishing me for being disruptive. You're punishing me for being heard." Those words didn't just hang in the air. They pierced it. A reporter in the gallery dropped his pen. A legal intern whispered to herself, "She's right." The judge didn't respond. She didn't have to. The silence was answer enough. The bailiffs reached for Jasmine's arms, not aggressively, but hesitantly, as if their bodies were moving faster than their beliefs. The bailiffs moved with the stiffness of men carrying out an order they didn't agree with, their training clashing with their conscience. Jasmine had already risen from her chair, unprompted, unshaken. Her movement wasn't slow, nor was it forced. It was steady, grounded. She didn't look at the judge nor the prosecutor. She didn't look at her attorney either. She looked forward, past the cold marble walls, past the cameras, into something bigger. Something that couldn't be silenced by a courtroom or contained in a transcript. Her shoulders stayed square, her hands relaxed at her sides. And though two uniformed officers stood on either side, there was no mistaking who was actually leading the walk out of that courtroom. The cameras didn't miss a single detail. They captured her standing tall as the gavel dropped. They captured the moment the bailiff's hand lightly touched her arm, and she allowed it. Not because she had to, but because she chose not to turn this into their narrative. They caught the poise in her walk, the fire behind her eyes, the refusal to be framed as anything other than what she was. A woman punished for standing too firm, speaking too clearly, and refusing to flinch. And they captured that look when Jasmine turned her face ever so slightly toward the gallery window and stared directly into the lens of a waiting camera. It wasn't performative. It was deliberate. Her eyes said everything her voice no longer could. This is not justice. This is the system caught in the act of protecting itself. Reporters outside the chamber clutched their microphones tighter as the doors cracked open. The noise erupted instantly. Shouting, camera shutters firing like machine gun bursts, live feeds scrambling to reframe the moment in real time. But Jasmine? She didn't flinch. She walked as if the ground beneath her belonged to her. As if she knew this wasn't an ending, but a page being written in bold ink. Inside, the audience remained frozen, some staring, some blinking like they had just woken up. Even Judge Langston, whose gavel had started this, avoided looking at Jasmine as she was escorted out. Power had won the moment, but lost the room. One reporter whispered into a mic, "She's walking like she's already cleared her name." A young clerk near the back didn't even bother writing anymore. He just watched, stunned. And above it all, the courtroom's own surveillance footage caught the image that would travel the world. Jasmine Crockett, walking between two officers, eyes up, mouth closed, spine like steel. That single frame would be replayed, reframed, and reposted millions of times, not because she fought back, but because she didn't have to. The fight was in how she carried herself, in how her silence screamed louder than any argument. She didn't cry, she didn't yell, she didn't plead. She walked like someone who knew that while they could escort her out of a courtroom, they couldn't escort the truth out of the country. And in that moment, while Langston sat surrounded by silence and robes, and Jasmine disappeared into the sea of flashbulbs beyond the courthouse door, it became clear to everyone watching. The law had spoken, but justice hadn't. Not yet. And as the heavy courthouse doors closed behind Jasmine Crockett, the real trial began. Not in that courtroom, but in the court of public opinion. Within minutes, the footage exploded online. The clip, only 43 seconds long, showed Jasmine rising calmly, speaking firmly, and being escorted out for nothing more than refusing to water down her truth. No shouting, no theatrics, just conviction, just clarity, just control. Social media lit up like a wildfire. The hashtag "Let Her Speak" trended across every platform. People didn't need to understand legal jargon to recognize what they had just seen. A woman being punished for using her voice. Lawyers, civil rights groups, and political commentators from both sides of the aisle reposted the video with one question echoing through the noise. How is this justice? By nightfall, the clip had surpassed 10 million views. Major news networks replayed the footage on loop, some with analysis, others with silence, letting the images speak for themselves. Veterans groups issued statements condemning the courtroom's actions. That woman took a hit and didn't flinch, one Marine wrote. That's leadership. A former federal judge speaking on a late-night broadcast didn't mince words. She wasn't disruptive. She was principled. She didn't disrespect the court. She forced the court to show its true face. That soundbite went viral on its own. Law professors began publishing essays overnight. Editorials used phrases like weaponized silence and procedural betrayal. It was no longer just about Jasmine. It was about every voice that had ever been told it was too bold, too inconvenient, too much. Then came the leak, an uncut courtroom recording, obtained and anonymously shared by someone believed to be a court staffer, hit the internet like a bomb. It showed the full exchange, frame by frame. It captured Judge Langston's tone, the smirks from the prosecution, the moment Jasmine's objections were ignored, not because they were wrong, but because they were right. The full footage revealed the subtle cues, Langston's escalating frustration, the calculated interruptions, the deliberate disregard for protocol. This wasn't a breakdown in order. It was a controlled demolition of fairness. The video confirmed what millions had suspected. Jasmine wasn't removed for breaking the rules. She was removed for refusing to play by a script designed to silence her. What had started as a courtroom ruling had now become something far larger, a reckoning. But as Jasmine's removal ignited a national conversation, her legal team didn't just react. They retaliated with strategy sharpened by urgency. The moment the courtroom footage leaked, the phones in their legal office didn't stop ringing. Attorneys from across the country called in. Former judges, constitutional scholars, clerks, allies. They weren't offering sympathy. They were offering support, precedent, and firepower. Jasmine's lead counsel, Angela Monroe, didn't wait for the outrage to fade. She stood in front of a whiteboard plastered with timelines, quotes, and violations. "We're not just getting her out," she said to the team, voice clear, eyes fierce. "We're getting Langston off this case." Everyone understood. This wasn't just a defense motion. It was a legal reckoning. For the next 10 hours, the team moved like a war room. Legal aides combed through footage frame by frame, flagging timestamps where Jasmine was cut off mid-sentence, where objections were ignored, where Langston's tone shifted from judge to adversary. Every moment was documented, transcribed, and marked with citations from federal judicial conduct codes. Angela dictated the motion like a general delivering orders. "We argue judicial misconduct, due process violations, abuse of discretionary power, and bias. And make it clear, this wasn't law. This was punishment." Paragraph after paragraph was built with surgical precision. Not a single word wasted. The result was a 37-page emergency motion that didn't plead, it accused. The motion demanded two things. First, immediate dismissal of the contempt charge on the grounds that it was retaliatory, unsupported by legal standard, and inconsistent with courtroom procedure. Second, the recusal of Judge Meredith Langston from any and all future proceedings involving Jasmine Crockett, citing a clear erosion of judicial neutrality. Attached to the motion were 4 exhibits: uncut courtroom video, sworn statements from legal observers, excerpts from courtroom transcripts, and a declaration from a retired federal judge who had reviewed the footage and called Langston's actions an affront to everything the judiciary stands for. By midnight, the filing was sent to the Federal Appellate Review Board. By 2:15 a.m., Monroe was on a video call with a senior appellate clerk confirming receipt. The clerk didn't offer comment, but his pause before hanging up said everything. "We've, never seen anything quite like this." In another room, someone refreshed Twitter. The number Recuse Langston hashtag had hit 4 million posts. Major newspapers were updating headlines in real time. Jasmine's team didn't cheer. They didn't pop champagne. They didn't even rest. They looked at the clock. They looked at each other. And Monroe said what everyone was thinking. Now it's the system that has to answer. And for the first time since Jasmine was let out in silence, the law wasn't just on the offensive. It was under pressure. And while Jasmine's legal motion shook the foundation, the response from the system came faster than anyone expected. Just 48 hours after the emergency filing hit the federal docket, the Judicial Conduct Oversight Commission, a body rarely seen in the public eye, announced an emergency closed-door hearing. No press, no leaks. Just a single, stark statement. The matter of judicial conduct involving the Honorable Meredith Langston will be reviewed immediately. That alone sent a tremor through the legal community. This wasn't just about Jasmine anymore. This was about a federal judge, a pillar of the old guard, being called to account by the very system she thought she could manipulate. Behind those closed doors, 3 senior judges, 2 ethics officers, and 1 Department of Justice liaison gathered around a heavy oak table stacked with evidence. Raw footage, annotated transcripts, expert statements, and a mountain of legal precedent. They didn't debate feelings. They dissected facts. Every second of courtroom video was scrutinized. Langston's interruptions, her refusal to acknowledge objections, her sudden elevation of tone from neutral to adversarial, her final declaration of contempt, timed not to disorder, but to disagreement. The commission reviewed side-by-side comparisons of Jasmine's testimony with accepted courtroom protocol, and as they did, a single conclusion became impossible to avoid. Langston hadn't lost control. She had used control as a weapon. It was not an error. It was intent, calculated, surgical, and absolutely indefensible under the ethical standards of her office. One commissioner was heard stating behind closed doors, "What we're looking at here isn't a procedural misstep. It's judicial theater." She crossed the line, and she knew it. The ruling came swiftly. A formal statement was released just after dawn the next morning. It was only 3 pages long, but every line hit like a gavel. This commission finds that Judge Meredith Langston demonstrated a clear and deliberate abandonment of judicial neutrality, exercised punitive authority without legal grounding, and acted in a manner unbecoming of the bench. The final paragraph delivered the blow. Langston was to be immediately removed from any active proceedings involving Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, and her actions referred to the Chief Circuit for further disciplinary review. It was unprecedented, historic, and absolutely justified. For the first time since Jasmine was silenced, the scales had shifted, and this time, they tipped in her favor. And so, with Judge Langston formally removed and the contempt charge vacated, the paperwork was processed faster than anyone expected, almost as if the system itself was trying to make up for lost time. But there was no celebration, no camera-ready moment of triumph. Jasmine Crockett was released from the federal holding facility just before sunrise, the kind of hour when cities are still half asleep and everything feels colder than it should. She didn't walk out flanked by a parade of lawyers or swarmed by a cheering crowd. She walked out with dignity, alone at first, one step at a time, as if every footfall was part of a ritual, not of freedom, but of continuation. Her hands were free, but they didn't swing. They stayed by her sides, steady. Her face carried no smile, no anger, no exhaustion, just that same expression that had unsettled Langston from the witness chair. Quiet defiance. Angela Monroe, her lead attorney, waited outside holding the final ruling in one hand and Jasmine's coat in the other. She said only 4 words. "You're officially cleared, Congresswoman." Jasmine took the coat, glanced down at the papers, then looked back up at the sky. Still gray, still heavy, like the world wasn't ready for daylight. "Cleared on paper," she said quietly, "but the stain they tried to leave, That doesn't go away so easily. Angela didn't argue, because she knew Jasmine wasn't talking about her name. She was talking about the message that had been sent to millions of people watching, that even in 2025, a woman who speaks truth in power's face can still be dragged from a courtroom, not for breaking a law, but for breaking a pattern. A line of reporters had gathered near the barricades, muffled by early morning fog and guarded by agents who clearly didn't want another spectacle. Microphones were raised, questions fired. Do you feel vindicated? Will you sue Judge Langston? What happens next? Jasmine paused at the top of the courthouse steps. She looked at them, not with contempt, not with gratitude, but with calculation. She gave no answer. She didn't need to. Her silence said what words couldn't. This isn't over. Not even close. Her team moved around her like a quiet force field. Security whispered codes. Aides checked phones. The car door opened. Jasmine climbed in, not as someone rescued, but as someone reloaded. Inside, she sat back, watching the building shrink in the rearview mirror. It wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning of something sharper, something bigger, because freedom wasn't her goal. Accountability was. And systems like this didn't get fixed by a single overturned ruling. They were only exposed by it. She wasn't walking away. She was preparing to walk back in, with the law at her back and the truth still burning in her chest. And this time, she wouldn't be the one on trial. This time, the system would have to explain itself. And while the courthouse receded behind her, Jasmine knew her next step wasn't back to Washington or into a legal debrief. It was here, back to the people, back to the reason she'd stood tall in that courtroom to begin with. 3 days after her release, she stood behind a splintered wooden podium in the basement of a neighborhood library on the south side of the city. No stage lights, no velvet backdrop, just linoleum floors, aging ceiling tiles, and folding chairs filled with teachers, union leaders, veterans, churchgoers, teenagers with notepads, mothers with strollers, no PR firms, no makeup artists, just Jasmine, still wearing the weight of what she had survived and refusing to let it turn into silence. The room was packed, though the only cameras present were held by hands, not mounted on tripods. People came not for spectacle, but for clarity, for truth, for her. She approached the mic slowly, deliberately, as if every step forward was a reminder that she wasn't supposed to be here. She was supposed to be subdued, discredited, forgotten, but instead she was louder than ever, even in quiet. Jasmine placed her notes gently on the podium, though she wouldn't read from them. She looked up, eyes steady, voice low, but full. I want to thank you, she began, for not just watching, but for seeing. Because what happened to me wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a courtroom error. It was a message. Her gaze swept the room, from the teenagers in the back row to the retired educators in the front. It was a message that people like me, people who speak too directly, stand too firmly, refuse to shrink, don't belong in rooms of power unless we learn how to whisper. A murmur rippled through the crowd, not of surprise, but of recognition. Jasmine continued, her voice tightening, gaining strength with every breath. I wasn't arrested for breaking the law. I was arrested for not breaking myself to fit into a system designed to protect the powerful from uncomfortable truths. I was warned. I was silenced. I was removed. Not because I disrupted the courtroom, but because I didn't bow to it. The room was silent, but it wasn't still. People were leaning in, gripping the edges of their chairs, blinking faster than usual. Some recorded. Some just held onto every word. Let me be clear, Jasmine said, her hands now resting firmly on the edges of the podium. This wasn't just about me. It never was. This was about every voice that's ever been told they were too loud, too angry, too difficult. Every woman who's been told to watch her tone. Every Black person who's been told to lower their eyes. Every working-class American who's been told to leave justice to the professionals. Her voice rose, not in volume, but in precision. Like every sentence was a strike of the gavel she had never been allowed to hold. They thought they could use the law to scare me. What they did instead was show the world just how fragile the system becomes when someone refuses to be afraid. At the back of the room, someone stood, then another. The applause didn't come in waves, it cracked like thunder, sudden, uncontainable. Jasmine held up her hand, not to stop them, but to steady them. "We don't clap because this is over," she said. "We clap because we see it now. And once we see it, we don't get to unsee it." The clip of that line, just 9 seconds long, was uploaded within minutes. By midnight, it had been viewed 11 million times. Within 24 hours, law school professors across the country were referencing it in their lectures. Civil rights attorneys quoted her on cable news. Young organizers printed it onto posters. But it wasn't just viral, it was visceral. Something had shifted. Legal circles began buzzing not just with opinion, but with action. A coalition of former judges and legal scholars issued a public letter titled "Truth on Trial: A Call for Judicial Reform," demanding the creation of an independent oversight body for federal judges. One section of the letter was particularly blunt. "When a courtroom becomes a stage for silencing dissent, it ceases to be a temple of justice and becomes a fortress of fear." Harvard Law, Yale, Howard, and Stanford each held emergency panels discussing Jasmine's case. Not as a scandal, but as a precedent. A law professor at Columbia called it the Brown v. Board of Judicial Accountability. Proposed legislation surfaced within the week. It didn't come from Jasmine's office. It came from senators who had once distanced themselves from her. But now they stood on the Senate floor reading her words into the congressional record. "I wasn't arrested for breaking the law. I was arrested for not breaking myself." That sentence, written into law books, quoted in journals, painted onto murals, became more than a rallying cry. It became a mirror. Judges across the country were asked by legal associations to review their own courtroom conduct policies. One state Supreme Court quietly updated its internal ethics training. A judicial conduct reform bill picked up 34 co-sponsors in 2 days. The Department of Justice issued a rare statement acknowledging an internal review into recent events involving judicial discretion and procedural conduct. But Jasmine stayed quiet. She didn't make a media tour. She didn't appear on talk shows. She didn't cash in on her moment. She stayed rooted, speaking not where the cameras were, but where the consequences lived. Town halls, school auditoriums, labor union meetings. Each time, her message stayed the same. "I am not a hero. I am not a victim. I am a witness. And I am telling you what I saw from the inside." Because Jasmine Crockett knew this wasn't about her alone. It was about the pattern, about the power, about how easily systems designed to serve can be twisted to suppress, about how authority without accountability isn't justice. It's tyranny in slow motion. And so she kept showing up, not to be heard, but to make others feel safe to speak. The community library event that launched the national reform wave never made the front page of the Times. It didn't need to. It didn't scream. It didn't explode. It grew, quietly, relentlessly, like a seed dropped into soil cracked open by the weight of injustice. And what sprouted wasn't just reform, it was resistance. What began as an attempt to humiliate a woman in a courtroom had instead created a movement. One that didn't chant, didn't burn, it didn't break, it simply refused to forget. And in a nation full of noise, that kind of memory is the most dangerous truth of all. And as the movement gained speed, eyes naturally turned to the one person who had yet to face the music, Judge Meredith Langston. But Langston said nothing. No press conference, no public statement, no courtroom appearance. Her chambers remained closed. Her staff refused to answer questions. When reporters knocked, the doors stayed shut. And yet, the silence screamed louder than denial. It wasn't just the media that noticed. Behind the fortress-like walls of the Supreme Court building, cracks had begun to form. Clerks whispered of internal memos circulating between justices. Quiet calls were being made. Unusually long closed-door meetings were being scheduled at odd hours. The word reputation was suddenly being spoken in hushed tones. Not by journalists, but by senior judicial advisors. A source inside the Chief Justice's office leaked a single sentence to the press. "What's happening around Langston isn't just controversial, it's becoming unmanageable." The institution that once seemed untouchable was now visibly uncertain. Not because Jasmine had threatened it, but because she hadn't. Because she had never once called for Langston's resignation, never sued for damages, never demanded vengeance. She didn't tear down the system. She simply exposed what was already broken. And that, more than any slogan or soundbite, was what made her dangerous to those who had grown used to impunity wrapped in tradition. Reporters wanted blood. They wanted outrage. They wanted Jasmine to give them the quote that would finally tilt the power balance into full collapse. But she never gave it. Instead, she gave them this: "I don't want to replace injustice with revenge. I want to replace it with accountability. And that only comes through dialogue, not demolition." It wasn't the answer they expected, but it was the answer the country needed, because people weren't just angry anymore. They were awake. In her next public appearance, this time at a university law school, Jasmine stood at a podium beneath a worn American flag and addressed a generation raised on hashtags and headlines. "Justice," she said slowly, "isn't a gavel. It's not a robe. It's not even a courtroom. It's a commitment, a daily decision to treat power as a responsibility, not a weapon." The auditorium was silent, not from apathy, but awe. She wasn't grandstanding, she was testifying, and this time no one could cut her off. Meanwhile, Langston's legacy unraveled by the hour. Former colleagues who had once praised her discipline and composure now declined to comment. A federal judicial review panel released a quiet but damning summary of their findings: an erosion of impartiality under public pressure. That one phrase, surgically diplomatic but morally devastating, made the front page of the Washington Post. Editorials poured in. Even conservative legal scholars, once cautious in tone, began calling for mandatory external review of high-bench decisions involving public servants. Law schools began rewriting their judicial ethics modules to include Langston's courtroom as a case study in how quickly neutrality can become aggression when left unchecked. And through it all, Jasmine kept her promise. She didn't make it personal. She didn't chase Langston. She chased the principle. When asked on live television what she wanted to see happen next, she answered with disarming calm, "I want young lawyers to feel like the courtroom belongs to them, no matter how they look, how they speak, or what they dare to believe in. I want judges to remember that silence isn't always professionalism. Sometimes it's complicity." That quote, clipped into a 15-second reel, played across networks and student forums for weeks. And then something remarkable happened. Not a ruling, not a firing, not a headline, a shift. Proposals that once died in committee were reintroduced. Bipartisan support emerged for a new judicial accountability framework, a bill requiring external review panels for contempt citations involving elected officials, and mandating that any removal from court be subject to immediate independent evaluation. What once seemed radical now looked necessary. Senators stood on the Senate floor and cited her. Professors rewrote entire chapters of their textbooks and named the new section after her. Activists stopped yelling outside court buildings and started organizing inside them, using her words as curriculum, her story as blueprint. And through it all, Jasmine remained grounded. She didn't wear power like armor, she wore it like memory. At another speaking event, when a young black student stood up and asked how she didn't lose control when everything around her was designed to provoke it, Jasmine replied, "Because I wasn't alone. I walked into that courtroom carrying the weight of every woman who'd ever been told to lower her voice, every voter who felt unseen, every worker who was told their truth was inconvenient." Then she paused and added, "I didn't stand tall because I was unafraid. I stood tall because the alternative was to vanish, and I'm done disappearing." Judge Langston eventually requested a medical leave. It wasn't a resignation, and it wasn't public. But it was understood. She faded from the bench the same way she had avoided the spotlight. Silently. There was no apology, no acknowledgement, just absence. And somehow that felt fitting, because this story wasn't about her fall. It was about what her fall revealed. And Jasmine, she didn't slow down. She continued to speak, to listen, to push, not for punishment, but for repair, because her fight was never about tearing anything down. It was about rebuilding what had already collapsed under the weight of silence. In the end, there was no verdict read aloud, no gavel declaring victory, no dramatic confrontation. What there was instead was a wave, a subtle but powerful one, a wave of policy, reform, reconsideration, of judges looking inward, of citizens asking harder questions, of young people entering law not out of ambition, but out of purpose. The story didn't end in a courtroom. It ended in classrooms, committee rooms, street corners, court filings, midnight discussions between staffers writing the next bill. It ended where it began, not in noise, but in a voice refusing to go quiet. And maybe that's the real verdict. That truth doesn't need permission. That dignity isn't granted. That justice doesn't arrive with applause. It arrives when someone, somewhere, finally says, "This is enough." And Jasmine Crockett was that someone. She stood. She spoke. She endured. And in doing so, she didn't just challenge power. She reminded it that it answers to us. And while lawmakers debated reforms and headlines shifted to newer scandals, something far more lasting began to unfold. Not in courtrooms, but in hearts, in memory, in legacy. It started one evening, during a broadcast of a primetime interview show. The host had been doing a retrospective on the Jasmine Crockett case, tracing the legal, cultural, and political impact it had left in its wake. There were expected guests, policy analysts, law professors, social commentators. But then the screen cut to a quiet, grainy live feed from a modest living room somewhere in Birmingham, Alabama. Sitting in a worn armchair was Judge Elijah Rowe, 85 years old, eyes framed by thick glasses, his voice slower now but sharp with wisdom earned through time and trial. His skin was lined with decades of duty. His hands rested on a closed Bible and a yellowing copy of the Constitution. He spoke only once during the segment, but his words echoed across the country. Jasmine Crockett, he said, is not just a name. She's a sound we've waited too long to hear. She's the voice we dreamed about in the 1960s but didn't dare believe we'd live long enough to hear echoed back. He adjusted his glasses. We didn't march just for access. We marched for representation, for dignity, for truth that didn't tremble. And when I saw her in that courtroom, standing firm, not flinching, not apologizing, I thought, Lord, we finally got one who remembered what we were fighting for. The clip went viral within hours. But it wasn't the usual viral. This wasn't driven by outrage or algorithm. It was reverence. Generations reposted it. Children played it for grandparents. Professors played it in lecture halls. Activists stitched it into tributes. Elijah Rowe, who had once been one of the first Black judges appointed in the Deep South, was now witnessing the arc of history bend back toward what he'd once prayed was possible. And Jasmine Crockett became not just a name on reform bills. She became part of the story older voices had almost stopped telling, and the institutions noticed. Within 2 weeks, invitations began pouring into Jasmine's office. Not from cable shows or political fundraisers, but from law schools, from HBCUS, from Ivy Leagues, from night schools where first-generation students sat in plastic chairs after work. They didn't ask her to explain legal strategy. They asked her to speak to truth, to courage, to presence. They didn't want her as a cautionary tale. They wanted her as a living case study, proof that even when the system tries to erase your voice, you can turn silence into thunder. She stepped into those lecture halls not with flash, but with focus. She didn't come dressed like a political icon. She wore simple suits, carried no entourage, and stood behind old podiums like they were courtrooms reborn. Her story never changed, not even once. She didn't romanticize it. She didn't soften it. I didn't go in there looking for a fight, she said to one room full of law students. But when the fight found me, I knew I had to speak so clearly that even the gavel couldn't drown me out. She looked out over the sea of students, Black, white, immigrant, first-gen, wide-eyed, and said, the law's written, but justice is performed. It's in how you show up, how you listen, how you hold power accountable when the rules protect people more than principles. And then, as if offering a warning disguised as advice, she added, you'll be told to respect the room, and you should, unless the room forgets to respect you. Then you speak, and if they remove you for it, walk out like the room followed you. Each visit wasn't just a lecture, it was a spark. Professors revised ethics syllabi. Deans added her court footage to required viewing. Moot court teams studied her cross-examination and deconstructed how quiet, reasoned defiance had become more effective than 1,000 raised voices. One night, after a speaking event in Atlanta, Jasmine found herself walking alone through the law library. It was late. The halls were dim. Books stacked like monuments lined every wall. She paused at a section marked Civil Rights Jurisprudence, 1950 to 1970. Her fingers hovered over the spine of a biography on Thurgood Marshall. For a moment, her hands shook. Not from fear, but from the realization that she was now part of that same shelf. Not by choice, not by ambition, but because she'd been called to speak when most would have stayed quiet. Later that night, she wrote in her notebook, the same one she'd had with her the day of the hearing. A single line. They wanted compliance. I gave them memory. That line, once leaked by an aide, became another touch point in a cultural conversation that refused to fade. Civil rights museums requested her notes. A foundation quietly offered to fund a documentary. Legal scholars debated whether Jasmine's experience should reshape how contempt of court is defined, but Jasmine never centered herself in the debate. She always redirected it back to the principle, I didn't make that courtroom political. It already was. I just refused to pretend it wasn't. And slowly America began to admit something it rarely says out loud, that the law, while written in ink, is lived in flesh, and flesh can be silenced, dismissed, removed. Unless it speaks, like Jasmine did. In her final campus visit of the year, she closed with a moment that would become legend. A student asked, "What would you say to a judge now if they warned you again about being held in contempt?" Jasmine didn't pause. She looked out at the rows of students who would one day argue before those judges and said, "I'd say, with every ounce of respect, that contempt isn't a threat when you've already survived worse. And if telling the truth makes them uncomfortable again, I hope the next person in that seat won't just speak like I did. I hope they speak louder." And then she left the stage. No music, no spotlight, just a quiet walk off stage and the sound of pages turning behind her. As students, one by one, began writing their own truths down, because this was the lesson that would endure. Law is literature, but justice is language, and Jasmine spoke it fluently. And as Jasmine's story moved from streets and schools into textbooks and legal reform proposals, the next chapter was no longer just cultural, it was constitutional. The moment came unexpectedly fast. In a special joint session scheduled under growing public pressure, Congress convened an emergency hearing to debate a historic piece of legislation, the Federal Judicial Accountability and Oversight Act, a bill designed to limit the unchecked power of federal judges, including new protocols for contempt citations, independent review panels for courtroom conduct, and transparency requirements for judicial recusals. On the floor that day were senators who had once dismissed Jasmine as too loud, too reactive, too off-script. But now they listened. They watched. They leaned in. Because now she wasn't just speaking for herself. She had become the mirror they all had to face. Jasmine Crockett arrived not as a protester, nor as a victim, but as the living catalyst for the very reform being debated. The gallery was packed. Security was tight. Cameras were mounted high and still. She entered quietly, dressed in a simple black suit, no fanfare, no entourage. Just her and a folder filled with the language of the bill. Annotated, underlined, full of notes in the margins. A staffer offered her a speaking point summary. She declined it. "I've lived the testimony," she said. "I don't need to rehearse it." When her name was called to speak, the room stilled. The kind of stillness that hangs before a verdict. She stood, walked to the center lectern, and laid her hands flat on the wood like it was a bench of its own. Her eyes didn't scan the crowd. They locked in, not with defiance, but with clarity. "This bill," she began, "is not about vengeance. It's not about punishing judges. It's about reminding them, and reminding us, that the courtroom is not a kingdom. It's a place of accountability, and power without accountability is not law. It's control." There was no emotion in her voice, not because she lacked it, but because emotion wasn't needed to make the point land. Her presence was enough, her story already known. But what followed was what truly set the tone for the room. "You all saw the footage," she continued. "You saw what happens when a courtroom forgets that its job is to hear, not to silence, to measure, not to crush. What happened to me wasn't exceptional. That's the problem. It was systemic. I just happened to have a microphone loud enough that people couldn't ignore it." At the back of the room, one senator, a conservative known for his ironclad loyalty to judicial independence, shifted in his seat, his hands clenched. But even he didn't interrupt, because the moral scale had already tipped, and Jasmine wasn't demanding power. She was demanding balance. A few minutes later, during a break in the hearing, reporters rushed her in the hallway. The question came fast, sharp, like a dart thrown just to pierce the moment. "Congresswoman Crockett, after everything, will you run for Senate?" The hallway tensed. Even the staffers turned their heads. Jasmine stopped walking. She didn't fumble. She didn't smile. She didn't dodge. She gave an answer so precise it cut through every other narrative that had tried to stick to her name. "I'm not here for a promotion," she said. "I don't need a new seat. I need the law to sit in the right one." A pause, one breath. Then she added, "We don't fix this by climbing higher. We fix it by going deeper." That clip became the line that evening anchors opened their broadcast with. Not because it was political, but because it was real. And in an age of calculation and crafted image, Jasmine had become that rarest of things, unspinnable. Back inside the chamber, the markup for the Judicial Accountability Act resumed. Amendments were debated, clauses scrutinized, but the tone had changed. It was no longer abstract. Jasmine's presence had turned every sentence into a question of courage. And suddenly, those who once feared the optics of judicial criticism now feared the optics of silence. By the end of the session, 12 new co-sponsors had signed on. 2 of them had been on the fence until that morning. Later that night, Jasmine sat alone in her office, lights off, city humming beyond the window. She scrolled through messages on her phone, some from activists, others from quiet insiders. One text read, "We never thought we'd see this in our lifetime. You did it." She didn't respond, not because she wasn't grateful, but because she knew. She hadn't done it. The people who believed her had, the ones who watched the footage, who reposted it, who wrote to their representatives, who stood outside courtrooms. Not with anger, but with determination. All she had done was refuse to vanish. She leaned back in her chair and looked at the Capitol dome glowing in the distance. It looked smaller from where she sat, no longer unreachable, no longer untouchable, and for the first time since the hearing, she allowed herself to feel something close to peace. Not because the fight was over, but because it was no longer hers alone. The next morning, her schedule was full. More hearings, more interviews, more steps forward. But Jasmine Crockett didn't rise like a politician chasing headlines. She rose like a witness who had refused to forget what she saw and had dared to tell the nation anyway. And now the nation had to decide what to do with what it had heard. Not just a speech, not just a vote, but a chance to prove that justice wasn't just written on paper. It was something we chose, every single day. And while Jasmine Crockett never called it a victory, the world around her began to move like one had been won. The courthouse had gone quiet. The hearings were over. The cameras moved on. But the silence didn't feel like retreat. It felt like something reloading. Across the country, in living rooms, classrooms, legal clinics, and student unions, the story of a woman who refused to fold under the weight of power continued to spread. Not as a scandal, but as a signal. She hadn't shattered the system. She'd revealed it. And that, more than anything, lit a fuse that no institution could smother. It didn't start with campaign ads or new political parties. It started with choices. Students applying to law school who had once second-guessed their place suddenly wrote personal statements that began with her name. Public defenders with overstuffed caseloads decided to stay in the fight. A new wave of community leaders emerged, sharper, younger, louder, and when asked what sparked their entry into politics, their answers came without hesitation. She showed us what standing looks like when silence is demanded. Jasmine never took credit. She never made it about herself. She told her story the same way in every room, as testimony, not performance. "I'm not here because I'm special," she said in one speech. "I'm here because I stood still when the room tried to move around me." Her calm resistance, the unwavering spine in the courtroom, the refusal to back down under pressure, became a template for a new generation not looking for power, but for presence. Law schools started building her case into ethics curriculums. Political science professors framed her hearing as a turning point in the evolution of judicial transparency. But the most powerful shifts didn't happen in academia. They happened on the ground. A high school senior in Mississippi declared her intent to run for office. At 17. A first-generation college student in Chicago created a workshop teaching courtroom rights to young voters. They weren't inspired by Jasmine's office. They were inspired by her posture. The way she stood, spoke, and refused to break when everything around her demanded she shrink. And when reporters asked if she'd run for Senate, Jasmine didn't even blink. "I don't need a bigger seat," she said. "I need the law to sit where it belongs." That quote wasn't just printed, it was worn. It showed up on t-shirts, banners, posters, taped inside high school lockers and courthouse windows alike. It wasn't a slogan. It was a correction, the kind people carry with them when the system forgets who it's meant to serve. Jasmine's final speech that year wasn't on national television. It wasn't in front of Congress. It was in a packed auditorium at a community college in Philadelphia. No podium, no teleprompter, just folding chairs and voices ready to listen. She stood on the floor with the crowd and spoke without notes. "They thought removing me from a courtroom would end the conversation," she said. "But the thing about truth is, it doesn't stay where you put it. It moves, it multiplies, it finds new voices." Then she looked around at the students in front of her, most of them young, many of them never imagining themselves part of the process. "I was just the spark," she said. "You're the flame." And that's how it ended. Not with a verdict, not with applause, but with 1,000 new steps, moving toward power, not with fear, but with memory. They weren't asking to be invited in. They were already walking through the door. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.